morning, everyone. I think we can start now. Again, I wanted to welcome you to the second in a series of webinars designed to enhance the capacity of parliamentary staff around engagement in women's, children's, and adolescent health. My name is Petit Touré. I work with the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health. And on behalf of the organizing partners, I do want to welcome you. Those include the partnership, as mentioned, the Interparliamentary Union, WHO, the Countdown to 2030, Living Goods, as well as the Africa Population and Health Research Center. For those of you who were with us last week, you know that the objective of the series include to introduce parliamentary staff to issues and challenges related to women's, children's, and adolescent health, to provide information on how to analyze budgets with a lens towards women's, children's, and adolescent health, and to enhance legislative capacities as it pertains to the issue. Last year, you heard from the Countdown to 2030 as well as the WHO on women's, children's, and adolescent health trends and on inequalities in the different countries in the regions. For those of you that weren't able to join the call last week, in the Google Drive link that you received with the information for this call, you will have all of the background documents, and those include regional reports on women's, children's, and adolescent health. You'll have country profiles that provide you with the state of play in your different countries. You'll also have the presentations from the meeting as well as the recording of the webinar. And you'll also have the background documents for the meeting today, so for the webinar today. Additionally, you will all have received a survey that tried to assess your knowledge of the issues and expectations of the series. So if you haven't filled that out, I'm grateful if you could take some time to do that. Today, we're going to be looking specifically at legislation and the lawmaking process. You'll first hear from Rachel Mundilo, who's a senior legislative drafter at the Namibian Parliament. And she will walk us through how the lawmaking process can support women's, children's, and adolescent health. And after her presentation, we'll hear from Bishir Ndao, who's a senior advisor at UNAIDS, and he will walk us through some of the laws that are relevant for women's, children's, and adolescent health and how those laws can be strengthened. We're going to try to make the presentations today as interactive as possible. So last time we mentioned that you should feel free to send in any comments, any questions that you have throughout the presentations to the group chat so that we can see them and respond to them. But also today be ready to be prompted by the presenters to answer certain questions in the group chat. As always, please feel free or please remember to keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. And with that, I propose that we start. Rachel, will you walk us through your first presentation?
Hi, Caddy. Thank you for the introduction. I just need you to minimize the current screen so that I can share my screen for the presentation.
Yes.
There we go. Can everyone see that?
Perfect.
Okay. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rachel Mundilo. I am a legislative drafter in Namibia, and I will be taking us through a presentation on the lawmaking process and how we can introduce specific entry points to address women's, children, and adolescents' health issues within the lawmaking process. As Kari mentioned, I hope that this session will be interactive. Instead of having a breakout session, we have opted to include a few questions throughout the presentation. These can be responded to through the chat box as a time-saving mechanism. And we have allocated 5 minutes to as a response time. Basically, with regard to these discussions, there's no wrong or right answer. The aim is simply to discuss examples from our own experiences in our respective jurisdictions. And as much as we encourage responses through the chat box, if there's one or two people that would like to make intervention via the audio stream or the video stream, they are welcome to do so. The objectives of this session are to firstly establish the discourse aimed at considering the endless opportunities within the lawmaking to address women, children, and adolescents' health issues, and further entry points within the lawmaking process to address women's, children, and adolescents' health issues. So what the session seeks to do is to ensure that we continue to be mindful of the inroads we can make use of to address women's, children, and adolescents' health issues when exercising our respective roles in supporting the lawmaking process as parliamentary staff. As part of the presentation, we will discuss the lawmaking process and what that process entails. We will look at examples of legislation on women's, children, and adolescents' health. We will entry points within the lawmaking process to address. We'll discuss some mechanisms aimed at the implementation of legislation to ensure that legislation is indeed fit for purpose. We will look at the challenges on making laws for women's, children, and adolescents' health. We will also look at the impact that COVID-19 has had on the lawmaking process. And then finally, we will discuss some action steps that parliaments can take in realizing women's, children, and adolescents' health legislation. So what is the lawmaking process? The lawmaking process is described as a form of the state's activity intended on either the creation or the revision of legal norms. So generally speaking, this process is more or less the same in most of our jurisdictions or some variations.
Lawmaking process now to presentation.
I don't know if I should continue speaking, try and speak louder.
Maybe we need to tell them to mute the mic.
Wait until we mute them.
I will just mute them, yeah, thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. As I was saying, so legislation on women's, children, and adolescents' health and the lawmaking process. So sources of women's, children, and adolescents law may include national legislation, international and regional legal instruments, as well as national policy documents. So what I have observed is that most jurisdictions in sub-Saharan Africa rely on policy documents to address women's, children, and adolescents' health issues and not necessarily legislation. So the end result being that the obligations contained in those policy documents are not enforceable, and they often do not provide for remedial action where a person's rights have been infringed upon. And this highlights the need to translate policy into legislation to make sure that whatever is contained in the policy is indeed enforceable, and members of society can assert their rights. So women's, children, and adolescents' health issues transcend a wide range of legislative enactments, range of the different sectors that it transcends. National legislation can be grouped into social and economic determinants of health. These determinants include education, economic stability, neighborhood and built environment, health and healthcare, and the social and community context. These determinants can further be grouped into categories, transcending areas such as the criminal law, the family laws, and laws on equal opportunities. The next slide provides a non-exhaustive list of examples of legislation on women's, children, and adolescents' health matters. I have grouped these into the categories I referred to earlier, and the list gives us an indication of just how wide-ranging women's, children, and adolescents' health issues truly are. This slide provides an overview of some of the policy documents that have been developed on. This shows us just how wide-ranging these source documents can be, and it is therefore imperative that we create cohesion within the statute book to ensure that all these varying laws and policies actually speak to one another. So now that we have looked at the sources of the law on women's, children, and adolescents' health issues, we can now revisit the lawmaking process. So the lawmaking process can be grouped into the following stages. The first stage is the preparatory stage, which involves the birth of a bill. And this process includes the legislative stage, the review, and the drafting of the legislation. The next stage includes the parliamentary stages, which involves the parliamentary processes, including the first, second, third readings of legislation, committee considerations, and voting and the passage of the law. The third stage is the implementation stage of legislation, which covers the commencement of the law, the implementation and enforcement of the law, and the monitoring and evaluation of that law. So what are the entry points within this process? So within this process, we can identify different entry points within which we can address women's, children, and adolescents' health issues. These include the initiation, review, and drafting stages, which all form part of the preparatory stages that I mentioned previously, and the lawmaking process, and then the enactment stages, which encompasses the entire parliament stage, and finally the implementation stage, which includes the monitoring and evaluation of legislation. So let's consider some of these entry points. The first stage that I mentioned is the legislative initiative stage. So when considering the legislative initiative stage, it is important to keep in mind the following key questions. So who may initiate legislation? What is the process involved in initiating legislation? Is the process readily accessible to women, children, and adolescents? So the impetus for a new law often comes from outside Parliament or the government, from various organizations and interest groups. Civil society plays a key role in ensuring that women's, children, and adolescents have a voice on laws that are proposed that affect them. And the process on initiating legislation has not been formalized in most sub-Saharan African countries, and it ranges from invited spaces created by government as a response to the legal guarantees for citizen participation versus spaces created by the people themselves as a response to the failure of government to address issues that concern them. So vulnerable populations, including women, children, and adolescents, particularly in marginalized communities, have little or no access to the formal democratic spaces to engage with the state to achieve their goals. So there's an absence of an intermediary form of citizen participation which links civil society to the resultant legal framework. A recent opinion piece in South Africa highlights the importance for the inclusion of children's voices on issues that concern them. In recognizing the challenges of women, children, and adolescents' health, it is imperative that we encourage and establish platforms within the legislative process aimed at hearing the concerns of women's, children, and adolescents. The voices of vulnerable groups must adequately be included on issues that concern them, and public participation and engagement should not merely be a box-checking exercise aimed at complying with a certain legal mandate to consult. So public participation should in itself be meaningful, and the demographic pertaining to who was consulted and on what should always be at the fore. Our first discussion point is on the importance of engaging women, children, and adolescents' health. And again, as I've indicated, we've allocated 5 minutes to this discussion. You're welcome to provide responses in the chat box. Alternatively, if there's anyone who would like to intervene via the video stream or the audio stream, you're welcome to do so. The discussion is centered around the following question: who may initiate legislation in your jurisdiction? And are there any measures in place aimed at ensuring that the voices of vulnerable populations, women, children, and adolescents, are included in the legislative initiation process? Perhaps as an example from my own jurisdiction, legislation in Namibia is often initiated by government at the government level, but institutions such as the Law Reform and Development Commission got calls for proposals from the general public on any issues that they feel is important that they need to have addressed. And a new trend has also emerged more recently where particularly young people petition government via online platforms such as the change.org. So those are just some of the platforms that are available in the Namibian context. Any responses? Sorry, Katie, how do I go back to the chat box because I can't see it right now?
We'll flag if they come up in the chat box if you want to.
Okay, okay, so I can proceed?
Yes.
Should some more time.
We're not seeing anything yet. Guys, feel free to share your thoughts.
Okay. I guess everyone's still waking up. Maybe we can address this question later on in the presentation. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, so the next stage is the legislative review stage. This stage is aimed at reviewing the statute book to firstly identify shortcomings and gaps in the existing legislation, and secondly, to come up with entirely new legislation. So the review stage seeks to stimulate debate on what is needed by reviewing the existing policy documents and coming up with a position on a particular issue. During this stage, it is necessary to identify international standards and obligations and align these with the national policy, taking into consideration, of course, the national needs and capacities. So the review stage further calls for laws that are informed by evidence, data collection and public consultation with women, children, and adolescents is key in ensuring that laws are informed by what's happening on the ground. And emphasis should continue to be placed on the outcomes of any engagements that have been conducted with women, children, and adolescents, and any ongoing research into these issues. Excuse me. It has been recommended that the review stage should be institutionalized to ensure a cohesive methodological approach to legislative review and the collection of empirical evidence in the legislative review process. So what is meant by the institutionalization of the review process is that as an example, you can have international experts or consultants who come and, create all these wonderful, pieces of legislation. But when that process has not been institutionalized and a proper study of the statute book has not been conducted, you often end up with legislation that is lacking in the sense that some legislation might not have been considered. The next stage, and perhaps stage, is the actual drafting stage. So this stage, the policy often has been decided on, and it involves the technical process of translating policy into legal text by looking at what the policy seeks to address and how it wants to address it. For example, by placing obligation on certain individuals to act or not to act, and how this is achieved, of course, varies in all of our jurisdictions. And an important factor to note is that client and stakeholder education is key in realizing the drafting process. It is important that the instructing agency provides clear and concise instructions. And as a guide, it is necessary to state that the appropriate policy approvals have been obtained, meaning that in the case of primary legislation, for example, the bill has been approved as part of the legislative program. It is important to indicate the principal objectives intended to be achieved by the legislation. It is important to list any other proposals that relate to the main proposals that have already been effected or that are contained in other legislation or that may be reserved for future legislation. And finally, it is also important that the instructing agents provide all the relevant background information if the legislation arises from a report or from a judgment, and it is important to further mention any legal or other difficulties that you may be aware of. So the drafting process does not always involve reinventing the wheel, but it may involve an adoption of what has been done elsewhere by considering, international best practice standards and with the necessary modifications to suit our own local needs. The next area of discussion is on the review and drafting stage, and I just wanted to get some views on what extent your respective jurisdictions have institutionalized the legislative review process, and secondly, what are some of the challenges experienced in your respective jurisdictions with regards to the drafting of legislation?
Rachel, maybe while people are typing, you've gotten a couple of responses to the first question.
Okay, we can go back to that.
Yeah, so you have for the Gambia that it can be done through the executive or through the Ministry of Women's, Children's and Social Welfare, private member bills, or through committee bills. We're hearing in a couple of countries that they're moving from executive to promoting private member bills. So we're seeing this in Zambia, and we're seeing it in Kenya as well. Kenya's written in and said the government, individual members, and the public by way of petition to the Assembly. And then Zambia also mentioned—
Thank you very much for—
sorry, that civil society in consultation with the government have moved some bills.
Thank you for all those interventions. These are all very interesting, and I think they are replicated in most of our jurisdictions. Another interesting example is the one observed in many European jurisdictions, particularly with the European Union, and I think Belgium is one of the countries that have adopted a popular initiative process where members of the citizens of that particular country or citizens within the European Union can come up with a popular initiative, which is a citizen initiative process where you gather a certain number of signatures for a particular petition, and then this petition is handed over to an MP who would then drive the process. So back to our second discussion point.
Well, My colleagues have indicated what happens in Ghana. I would want to briefly add that we also have the Law Reform Commission, which usually reviews our legislation. And when there are concerns, those concerns are forwarded to the Attorney General's office. And again, the executive initiates such legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. And I think it highlights once again the importance of law reform commissions in having this legislative review stages. What is this, institutionalized within our respective jurisdictions. Commissions are popular in common law jurisdictions, but there are some civil law jurisdictions that do have law reform commissions. Some of the challenges experienced in your jurisdiction with regards to the drafting of legislation, if I can perhaps have an intervention or two on that.
The challenges generally.
Oh. Go ahead, sorry.
So now we can't hear you anymore. You may have gone on mute.
Okay, so the challenges generally with Ghana, one is the issue of consultation, public engagement. We've had occasions where legislation or a bill is prepared and then stakeholders come up to say that they were not consulted or they were not adequately consulted. That is one of the main challenges that arises. Sometimes the issue of also drafting under pressure leaves little room for the draft person to exercise all the professional, that he or she may want to, because the person is drafting under pressure, there's not sufficient time. And then the issue of public engagement. Those are the two main challenges.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Those are equally important challenges that are experienced in most of our jurisdiction. I would just like to add on there that in my personal experience, the challenges that we experience in terms of drafting legislation on issues are the uncertainty in what the policy actually entails. So once you get instructions, the policy is sometimes all over the place where you don't exactly know what is the direction that the sponsoring agency actually wants to take. You can get policy in the form of questions and responses that were fielded to during a public engagement exercise. However, there's no outcome from that engagement exercise as to what it is, what direction it is that the sponsoring agency would like us to take.
And Rachel, there are two other questions here that you may want to factor as you move on into the next section. Moses asks or notes that generally the laws are developed, but that there's a lack of costing that hampers implementation. And I don't know whether you were planning on discussing that. And then you have—
Can you repeat that, Kathy? I didn't quite hear you.
That when the legislations are being developed, there's a lack of costing that hampers implementation, and how that can be addressed. And then Natalie asks, whether you have an example of how the Namibia Parliament processes laws like SADC-PF laws, and towards specifically ensuring that the benchmark provisions are incorporated at the domestic level in legislation. So conversion of sort of regional policies into national policies.
Okay, thank you, Kari, for those two very important questions. perhaps I would address them at the end of the presentation, if that's okay with the participants. Okay, so moving along. The next stage after the review and drafting stage is the actual enacting stage, which is which involves the of legislation and includes the various committee stages as well as voting. So social issues don't always align with party politics, and politicians usually advocate for the agenda that will make them the most popular amongst the electorate. So to circumvent this, it is necessary to ensure that politicians buy into the proposed enactment. The Cobb and Elder model of agenda setting proves that raising sufficient public policy awareness on a specific topic ensures that it gains the attention of policymakers and may move to actual serious consideration. So various interest groups are always competing to transfer their interests to be the interests of policymakers. There are always more matters vying for the attention of policymakers than can actively be considered. So lawmakers can only address what they know and care about. So it is therefore important, and the onus is placed upon those in the space of women, children, and adolescents' health issues to ensure that public awareness and media engagement continue to signal to politicians on matters that may affect women's, children, and adolescents' health. The next discussion point is on the enactment stage, and I would just like to find out from the participants, are you aware of any strategies in your respective jurisdiction aimed at ensuring that, that there's a political buy-in on women's, children, and adolescents' health issues, or perhaps any other policy? Just some interventions on that. I mean, as an example, a strategy, for example, that I've seen employed in Namibia is where politicians would often field a popular a bill closer to an election just to make sure that they remain popular within the electorate. Those are just some of the strategies that have been made use. Any comments?
Well, in respect of Ghana, I am aware that the various ministries, especially the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Protection, they do their best to involve the political parties even at the stage of consultation where policy is still being prepared. So by the time the policy is approved by cabinet and the bill is drafted, there's generally a consensus on the matter, and it doesn't become an issue when it gets to parliament. So at the stage of drafting policy, politicians are usually involved at the stakeholder consultation stage.
That is a rather interesting intervention, considering that, you know, in most of our jurisdictions, particularly in mine, political parties are not involved in the policy creation and the drafting stage of legislation. Most of the time they see legislation for the first time when it is tabled in Parliament. So that is definitely an interesting consideration to ensure that, you know, that you have political buy-in at the policy stage. Thank you.
Yeah, but also in Zambia, I think we've also noticed that the NGOs have been involved in sensitizing the members of parliament. We've seen a lot of CSOs come into parliament to educate members of parliament on issues to do with women and children and adolescents. So I think that instead of just focusing on the executive, the CSOs have also taken a lead. They organize a lot of training for members of parliament so that they're aware about what is happening. Thank you.
I think related to that, Rachel, there's an interesting question here around how do you ensure that civil society aren't pushing their own interests, but really taking action in the interest of women, children, and adolescents. So I think it follows that question relatively well.
Sorry, how do you ensure that CSOs
are pushing the interests of populations rather than their own interests, institutional?
Well, that is an interesting intervention, and that's why at the beginning of my presentation, I highlighted the need of, you know, creating platforms for participation for women, children, and adolescents, perhaps in the individual capacities, as opposed to a collective ideology that is pushed by a certain civil society organization.
Katie, I also just wanted to plug in and say that in Uganda, but also in Kenya, we develop one plan, one monitoring and evaluation plan, and one strategy, so that then all actors, be it civil society, be it media, be it the executive, but also cabinet, all have to follow that one plan. And also roles and responsibilities are fully highlighted there. So as and when CSOs have a role to play, they work within the one plan, and there are also accountability mechanisms. I'd love to acknowledge that sometimes these are weak, but really the parliament is one place where the technical staff continue to update the parliamentarians, and then they hold governments accountable. And my colleague Stella is here with me, but she said that she'd be able to give more input around this at some point later. Thank you.
Thank you for that intervention. So the next stage, and perhaps the final stage, is the implementation stage, and where the question on the costing for implementation perhaps would also come into play. So the pre-webinar survey, which some of you have completed, flagged the implementation of legislation as a key challenge to women, children, and adolescents' health. And the implementation stage of legislation is perhaps the most pertinent in the lawmaking process. Excellent legislation on varying issues continues to be churned out by parliaments. However, we often see it turning into white elephants due to a lack of implementation strategies. And it is imperative that throughout the lawmaking process, emphasis is placed on implementation by ensuring that adequate resources are allocated, the costing factors are considered, and that the institutions that will drive or implement the specific legislation are adequately resourced, and provision is made for the creation of those institutions that are not yet in existence. An important aspect of the implementation stage is perhaps the parliamentary oversight function in the implementation of legislation and government policies. So mechanisms to ensure that implemented legislation is fit for purpose. I've highlighted 3 mechanisms, and the first being the parliamentary oversight function of legislation, which is the most widely used tool to review and supervise government and to ensure the implementation of policy and legislation. So Parliament holds the government to account on behalf of the people and ensures that government policy and action are both efficient and commensurate with the needs of the public. So Parliament should strive to monitor the achievement of goals set by legislation. Parliament sometimes insert provision in laws that oblige the government to make periodic reports on the implementation of legislation. It's one of the mechanisms that within the oversight function that Parliament can ensure that that government in fact implements the legislation. A second mechanism is the evidence-based lawmaking, and the evidence-based lawmaking is slowly gaining traction in a number of parliaments, and it is based on the premise that policy decisions taken on systematic evidence are better informed and produce better outcomes. So the area involving women, children, and adolescents' health issues stands to benefit greatly from this approach in ensuring that legislation is indeed fit for purpose. Lastly, the third mechanism would be the post-legislative scrutiny. post-legislative scrutiny has been described as a practice used to monitor and evaluate the implementation of legislation, ensuring that laws benefit constituents in the way originally intended by lawmakers. So post-legislative scrutiny looks at whether the law has been brought into force, whether secondary legislation has been enacted, and how courts have interpreted the law, if any. Post-legislative scrutiny is a traditional role of Parliament, but one that hasn't always been consistently performed as a result of perhaps constraints in resources. So parliaments such as the UK Parliament have adopted a systematic approach to post-legislative scrutiny by including it in their committee structures. So all select committees in the UK Parliament may conduct post-legislative scrutiny. In sub-Saharan Africa, we are mindful of the fact that not all parliaments have the capacity to conduct post-legislative scrutiny. For one, it is time-consuming. It requires further allocation of resources that are already hard to come by, such as, for example, research staff. And therefore, in recognizing these constraints, the South African Parliament, for example, modified the post-legislative scrutiny process by convening an external panel of experts to review, rather than having the post-legislative scrutiny aspect within the committee stages. They have appointed an external panel which has conducted post-legislative scrutiny on behalf of Parliament. The Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference that was held last year saw members of the Commonwealth call for more and improved post-legislative scrutiny to improve service delivery and accountability. So what are the challenges on making laws for women, children, and adolescents? I think I've highlighted some of these throughout the presentation, but just to recap, legislation, for one, cannot be used as a means to place a bandage over a broken leg. We need to address the challenges hampering the progression and implementation of laws on women, children, and adolescents' health. These include aligning statutory law and the customary law, the challenge to support and educate communities that continue to engage in detrimental practices such as child marriages need to be addressed. We need to ensure that there's political buy-in. Again, as previously discussed, actors in the women, children, and adolescent health spheres need to ensure that they continue to raise public awareness to pique the interest of lawmakers. Another challenge would be the resource allocation, so adequate resources to be allocated to the agenda of women, children, and adolescents' health. The budgeting approaches should be recalibrated from a top-bottom budgeting approach to a bottom-top approach. And iterative budgeting should also be looked at to ensure that there is room within that process to cater to the ever-changing needs of society. I think the next series will elaborate more on the budgeting processes and how these can be used to address women, children, and adolescents' health issues. Finally, we have a challenge of enforcement. So the enforcement of legislation is equally important. And the regulation of a specific area, we often see the regulation of a specific area driving that particular area into the underground. For example, the female genital mutilation, there was an example where after laws have been passed, it simply drove that the practice into the underground. So members of the community would rather do it outside of the public's eye. Oh, you have a question or a comment? I see a hand. Oh.
Hello, Rachel. Hello, Rachel. I think the issue, the issue of resource allocation, and I think one of the participants talked to issues of costing. I think at the time of enactment, it is important that the members of parliament are resourced with manpower or researchers who can provide the costing. Now, for example, in Zambia, we've got the budget office. So when the law is presented to parliament, the budget office has the expertise to undertake costing so that we don't have a situation where the law is passed and it's not implemented because we didn't assume so much resources. And so when the law is going back to parliament, you ensure that you provide the costing to the law so that the members are aware of how much it will cost to implement that law. If it is too much, I think they can take care of that so that we don't have a situation where the law is not implemented because there are no resources.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Are there any other challenges that perhaps the participants can think of that may hinder the lawmaking process and the implementation of legislation and policies? This is just another discussion point.
Okay, I wanted to quickly speak on the issue of costing and to indicate that in Ghana, the requirement by the executive is that the policy which is submitted to cabinet for approval must have embedded in it a fiscal impact analysis, which is usually authenticated by the Ministry of Finance to determine how much cost is involved as far as that policy is concerned. Subsequently, our Public Financial Management Act requires that any legislation introduced in Parliament should be accompanied with a fiscal impact analysis, indicating again how much that policy will affect the finances of the country. Currently, we've not had other countries. I think there was a problem somewhere, but currently we've not had ministries implement that part of the Public Financial Management Act. But again, with respect to the private members' bills, efforts are being made to ensure that the budget office, which was recently established, together with the research office, assist members of parliament who intend to introduce private members' bills to cost how much that will be on the finances of the country. That is how far Ghana has gone on that matter.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Are there any other comments? Okay. I think we can move on. So how has COVID? Oh, yes, go ahead.
Hello, this is Nancy, and I want to speak from the women, children, and adolescent health space in terms of the lawmaking processes. For us who work in the women, children, and adolescent health space, in terms of providing the actual services are supposed to be guided. Many times we are quite confused about what evidence was used in formulating certain laws. For example, we have seen quite a number of countries lowering the age of consent for sexual activity. And we have overwhelming evidence in our databases that show the adverse effects of early sexual debut, not just pregnancy-related, but other health-related consequences and other social and economic consequences. And so for us, we always wonder, what was the basis for enacting of this particular law? We actually have the evidence to the contrary of this. Sometimes we also have laws, especially in the adolescent space, that are so many and they have different age cutoff points, and it becomes very, very difficult for us to synthesize and know what to do when. For example, we have a different age cutoff point for marriage in different countries, the age of marriage. We have a different age cutoff point for rape. We have a different age cutoff point for what a child can do or cannot do. We have a different age cutoff point for when you can provide consent for a surgical procedure. So when we have all these different cutoff points that we are applying to the same age cohort, it becomes very, very difficult for us to know what to apply when, because we always have to be triangulating and thinking, okay, this child or this adolescent is defined as, are they supposed to give consent for surgical procedure? And then it says a child should have someone to give the consent, but yet we have another law that has been introduced that says that the adolescent can consent to an abortion procedure without anybody listening to them, or an adolescent can get married, and then we say the same age, if you have sex, whether you consent or not, it's rape. So it becomes extremely confusing to us, and we really need help from the legislature to really align the laws affecting women, children, and adults, especially adolescents, to make it easier for us to provide services within the law. Over.
Rachel, as you reflect on that, I think there's a related question from Zubair, who's asking for examples of evidence-based lawmaking. For instance, whose data is used and how do you prevent various interests from influencing the evidence process? And I think that's somewhat linked to what Nancy was just saying. And then a question that we may not have answered and that you can take at any point is Tasneem asked about the earlier discussion on engagement. What are some practical recommendations for the inclusion of youth and children in the lawmaking process? So if anything, if you have any examples about that.
What are some of the examples? Sorry, I didn't get that last part. You were cut off.
Of inclusion of children and youth, as you talked about the consultation process.
Okay,
So
thank you. Thank you.
Children and youth.
Okay, I think I will address that in the as part of this presentation in the next slide on some of the examples that we can include with children and adolescents in the lawmaking process. Thank you very much, Dr. Nancy, for your intervention with regards to the evidence aspect of the lawmaking process. I think, for example, the Kenyan Parliament has particularly been championing evidence-based lawmaking processes, and they have particularly established champions that evidence-based lawmaking champions by creating a parliamentary caucus on evidence-based lawmaking. And I think there are some interventions in the health legislation in the Kenyan Parliament that have made specific use of evidence-based lawmaking. I hope that covers it. And then moving on. The next discussion is on how COVID-19 has impacted the lawmaking process. So COVID-19 The curfews, lockdown, and restrictions on gatherings has suspended participatory democracy to some extent in most of our jurisdiction. And as a result of these restrictions, it has become a challenge for policymakers to engage citizens, especially those at the grassroots levels, including women, children, and adolescents. So COVID-19 presents an opportunity to refocus how we engage with women, children, and adolescents to ensure that they laws that may directly or indirectly affect them during these times. Possible action steps. We have sought to provide some action steps that parliaments can take in increasing or addressing women, children, and adolescents' health. The first action steps is the need to take positive steps towards increasing women, children, and adolescents' participation in the lawmaking process. And this can be done by, and here comes the examples, convening a youth health parliament, which has been observed in South Africa, or the commissioning of participatory research to investigate any health issue affecting children. Secondly, the next action step is the introducing and evaluating the implementation of legislation. So we place it upon the participants of this webinar to investigate how we can include monitoring and evaluation on the implementation of legislation, and perhaps also to investigate how we can incorporate post-legislative scrutiny into the Parliament's activities. Thirdly, the third action step is to establish parliamentary champions and parliamentary caucuses on women's, children, and adolescents' health to ensure that these issues, parliamentary caucuses, actually focus on addressing women, children, and adolescents' health. The final action step would be to commence the process of review of legislation on women, impacting women, children, and adolescents' health in our respective jurisdiction. This process can be commenced by gathering current legislative enactments and examining what gaps there are in the legislation and in the statute book. So we will be following up on these action steps in 3 months. Thank you very much for your time, and that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was great. I think there's one question from Sandra that just came in that might be helpful for you to answer. And she asked, how do you ensure that children and adolescents know when a law has been passed and where to seek redress if there's an infringement?
Again, this speaks to the public awareness aspect of the lawmaking process. It is imperative, as I've mentioned before, that persons within the space of women, children, and adolescents' health continue to raise awareness, continue to sensitize our communities on the issues that relate to women, children, and adolescents' health, to ensure that there's engagement with the communities in the processes, in the lawmaking process. Again, the role of civil society organizations also plays a role in the sensitization area.
Thank you so much. That was extremely informative, and we saw some very good conversations. I want to move us on quickly to Bashir to give him time to get through his presentation. I know that we already have a couple of people who would like to make comments, Shiba, so that so perhaps Shiba, if you want to come in now while Bashir loads his presentation.
There's another hand from Nancy as well.
Okay, Nancy, do you want to go while we wait for Shiba and Bashir?
Hello. I forgot to lower my hand. I've lowered my hand.
Hello.
Okay, well then Shiba's here. Shiba, please go ahead, and then.
I thought I think my mic was still on mute. Sorry about that. What I was saying is that the comment I wanted to make was on the earlier part when we're talking about the stakeholders and how they could somehow sometimes try to push their own agenda and everything. But I think Gloria spoke to aspects of that, so it's covered. It's covered. Thank you.
Okay, super. Thank you. Bashir, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kadi. Can anybody hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you so much, Kadi, and congratulations to Rachel for the brilliant presentation, which will also kind of allow me to also say a few things and perhaps also talk to you about legislation and how legislation really affects health, and in particular women, children, and adolescent health. But also, talk to you also about what can be done to improve such legislation. I'm also going to present some pieces of legislation, at least, to propose to you, of course, for further discussion, for how we can really ensure that the health of everyone, especially those we're talking about, children, women, adolescents, and of course, from also a human perspective. So basically, I'm just going to kickstart. Basically, to say that this is, as you can see from this slide, it's a set of commitments that have been made by governments across Africa and the regions. And you can see all the treaties and declarations and conventions and so on and so forth. And this also point to the important shift in ensuring that all human rights, including the right to health and the right to sexual reproductive health and rights for young people in general, are really guaranteed by all these treaties and the legal instruments. They also provide us and to all the other and to also all the countries a clear guidance also on basically enacting specific laws and of course the policies to protect adolescents and the children and women's health. So this is basically just to give you a quick overview, but I was very interested to hear just earlier the discussion about the age of consent to sexual activity, and I think this is really an important part also of this seminar, because we're trying to really look at how this particular topic can really be discussed, and for us also to find specific solutions to that. And as you can see, the law on age of consent to sexual activity in Africa, and you can see some of the countries that I was able to select, does not always, of course, reflect the reality, because the majority of countries do not have a minimum age of consent to sexual activity in their laws and in the legal frameworks. But also this means that the age of consent needs to be looked at from a variety of angles. For example, we can see that where the age of consent is specifically stated in some countries, we can see also globally that the age of consent much lower for girls than for boys in this particular slide, as you can see. And this situation creates...
Sorry to interrupt you. Could you speak a little bit closer to your mic?
Is it better now? Is it better?
A little.
A little. Sorry, I'm using a new headset, but how about now?
That works.
Works. Okay, I'm gonna try to remain close to the mic like this. So I was basically saying that by looking at this particular slide, you know, where the age of consent is specifically stated in the legislation, and also observing this particular slide, you can see that the age of consent to sexual activity is much lower for girls than it is for boys. Looking at Tanzania, Comoros, for example, you can clearly see that. And of course, the issue also here is if you have a 12-year-old child in some country that will not require the same level of service than an 18-year-old. And of course, this is a big problem because obviously we cannot treat a 12-year-old than an 18-year-old who have different needs in terms of accessing services, of course. But of course, I also want to talk about perhaps the influence also of either the religion here or the tradition, because if you look at Tanzania and the Comoros, obviously, and that would link us also to the issue of child marriage, which has been also discussed earlier. But we're going to come back to, because I have a specific slide also later about the influence of the traditional and religious influence. Basically, and then very quickly, we don't have much time. And this is an example of positions, if you want, of legal reform, which is also quite needed. And we need to obviously look at how this particular situation really affects our desire to ensure that we do have a harmony between the age of consent to sexual activity, but of course also with the needs of these same population groups. And so we clearly need to set out the minimum age of sexual consent, of sexual activity, but also the age of consent to sexual activity will have to be aligned with the age of consent to other services, including health and sexual and reproductive health and rights, and so on and so forth. But we also need to look at how to narrow the specific legislation as well, in making sure that people in that particular group, especially the adolescent population, should really be able to access these services by having really a clear legislation in place that is able to not only articulate their needs, but also to harmonize actually not the situation legally speaking, but to ensure that this particular situation can really lead to an improved legal framework to address their needs. And the last point in that particular slide is in terms of policy. What specific policy do you really need to address this particular situation? So here is a proposal, is to provide guidance on the recognition of the evolving capacities of adolescents and normative sexual development. So I think this is a very important aspect as well, because sometimes, of course, the law might not be enough in terms of addressing the issue, but we need also clearly policies, a clear policy that will also really be efficiently used and implemented in support of the law. And when we talk about policy as well, most of the time it's really important that the policy also can really help articulate and also raising awareness or sensitizing with not only the law enforcement or the legal, but also the population themselves we're trying to serve in that particular context. Please feel free to send any specific question you may have at this stage, because I think it's really important to make it as interactive as possible. And I'm going to be moving to the next slide, which now deals with the age of marriage. This issue was also been raised earlier by some of the participants. And looking at this particular slide, obviously we can see that the child marriage is widespread across the region, and that the combination of customary and statutory laws in many countries also complicate the age of consent to be married.
Bashir?
Yes?
Me again, sorry again. I'm seeing that a couple of people are still having a very hard time. Is it possible for you to speak without the headset?
Okay, let me do that. How is that possible? Is it possible?
Much better.
Much better, okay. Well, sorry everybody, I'm going to thank you, Kari. So the slide here on the age of consent to marriage, I was saying basically that in most instances, there seems to be a conflict between the different legal systems. And the age of consent to marriage also is not clear or even codified for the majority of cases in customary law, and is also in most instances much lower than 18 years old. As you can see in this presentation, in this slide, only 8 countries actually have set the minimum age of consent to marriage at 18 years old or above, without any exception. And you can also see from this slide that you can see 6 countries that have a different age of consent to marriage. And this is true for both males and females. And of course, with an average of 15 years as well for women and females, I mean young adolescents, and 18 years old for boys. So this is also quite an interesting way to look at this particular slide. But of course, in terms of recommendations in the legislation, I think it would be good to really set a minimum age of consent to marriage to 18 years old, and this also without any distinction or exception between whether you're a boy or you're a girl. Obviously, we need to also look at how to introduce a model legislation. For example, here I mentioned the SADC model law on eradicating child marriage and protecting children already in marriage. So that's also quite interesting to take a look at. Obviously, we need to look at how to prohibit and criminalize under the law the giving out of a child in marriage or facilitation of a child marriage. Obviously, this is an issue that goes beyond the laws, and this issue needs to also be brought to the attention of religious, traditional, cultural leaders, and if we want to really change such practices. As I had mentioned earlier, in so many countries, giving a child to marriage at the age of 12 or 13 or 14 sometimes has to do with religion, or tradition, or other cultural aspects. So the law will have to really make an effort here to raise that minimum age of marriage to an age where At the same time, we're able to protect the interests and the needs and the rights of the child. For that instances. Obviously, that is more discussion, and I'm sure there will be some reaction to that. We need to also ensure that the minimum age of consent to marriage takes precedence over any cultural, traditional, and religious customs and practices. And I think this is very clear that we need to articulate that in a very stronger way. Enacting system to for birth registration system, for example, is also could be effective to at least minimize that spread of child marriage, and of course also consider any children really that any marriage is not concluded, and we are able to make sure that laws should need to step forward to outlaw child marriage. And policy-wise, we need to develop more comprehensive policies, again, to really look at what are the root causes of child marriage or forced marriage. And again, it goes beyond also the poverty justification, it goes beyond the family justification. And we need to look into this in a more holistic way and look at also the influence of religion and tradition, of course, and see how to have more advancements in this particular topic. I will now move to the age of consent to health services, because I think this is an important aspect of what we're trying to discuss here, because looking at adolescents and how this particular context can also ensure that the age of consent to healthcare, for example, include, of course, access to contraceptives, health services in general, including counseling, HIV counseling, testing, for example, and even abortion, because this has been also mentioned earlier by some of the colleagues. And this particular situation can really lead to even more confusion as to when young people can themselves consent to any treatment, medical treatment, but also whether they will need also consent from a parent or a guardian. So this is definitely an issue that could potentially further create even more barriers to accessing services, and make and undermine also the capacity of young people to access services. In some countries, we have some laws that also what we call age-restrictive legislation that are really impeding young people, adolescents, girls and boys and girls to access services. And this is also an interesting situation, because while in some countries we are legally speaking allowing young people to have sex or to be even sexually active, at the same time in other countries they're not even able to access information about sexuality, about contraceptives, and I mean, so there seems to really be there a bit of contradiction in the legislation as well. So I think we need to look into that maybe more closely. In terms of the recommendations in the legislation, I think that would be really useful to set the age of consent to 12 years, for example, for HIV testing, pre and post counseling, and this, of course, without parental consent, because we're seeing that in so many instances, it's difficult to obtain this consent from parents. And that does not mean also to encourage young people at that age to have sex. Here we're talking also about just accessing those services and just be able to access any type of testing with, but also counseling and post-counseling. We need to also look at how we can clearly state in legislation that healthcare providers need also to respect the views and opinions of adolescent girls and boys and young people in general, because for confidentiality issues. So we are observing at UNH that most of the time the issue of confidentiality is very much an issue, and sometimes it can cause a barrier for accessing services when people are not safe, and when people are not trusting the healthcare providers that whatever is going to be discussed may not actually remain confidential. So this is another issue to look into that. And the last point here is to set the age of consent based on the maturity of the person people are receiving the services, and particularly adolescent population. And to also look at how the law then could provide more guidance to healthcare providers and also how to address the perception of the age of patients they're receiving. In terms of recommendations in policies, I think we definitely need more guidelines for the provision and utilization of services, and of course it goes also beyond the SRH issues, but we're thinking about broader services. But when it comes to adolescent girls and young women, for example, for children in general, obviously we need to really see how to not only have guidance, but how do we make them also, how do we adapt those guidance to the issues we're dealing with. And the last point is how do we develop a policy that sets out the benefits of accessing services for adolescents, children and women in general. Carrie, is there any question at this particular point in time that I need to?
No, just want to note that we're running out of time. We only have 5 minutes left to the whole webinar. And Nancy did flag that it would be important for us to consider that a 15/16-year-old has 4 to 5 times higher risk of pregnancy-related complications and mortality than a 20-year-old. And so that becomes important to factor into the lawmaking process.
Okay, fantastic. Perhaps let me, for the sake of time, because I really wanted to be interactive, maybe very quickly, so I'm not going to spend too much time on criminalization of consensual sexual acts among adolescents, but I think it's just important that criminalizing such behavior actually can actually create even more problems and more barriers for them to access health services, and it could also potentially lead to more stigma and the normal sexual development of young people in general. And so countries need to really take a look at this particular situation of criminalization of consensual sexual acts among adolescents, and perhaps explore the possibility of decriminalizing it, and perhaps look at how to focus more on educative approaches that will potentially further enable and empower young people to be able to make more informed decisions and choices about their own sexuality and the needs. So I'm just gonna, I'm not gonna talk to the legal. I think I shared with all of you as well the documents that are basically based on this presentation on. for everybody maybe to take a further look at it. So let me just move perhaps to this particular point, which I think is very critical, and I will stop there because I think it's really, as you can see from this particular slide, some countries actually have opted to include protection of children against harmful cultural practices in their constitution, and child-specific legislation, including raising the age of consent to child marriage to, for example, eradicate forced and early marriages. So I think this is very, very important in terms of recognition of the customary law, but also the existence of the dual system. Those countries actually finance themselves in. But we need to also realize that criminalization of harmful cultural practices may actually be a good start, even though we are very much conscious that there is a need to ensure that the legislative provisions can translate into practice and also enforce, make sure that these type of offenses are prohibited and are addressed with legally. And the last one here, I'm just perhaps also sharing some recommendations here on how the legal interpretation maybe could look like, but as well as policy that can really also help us look at more broadly how we can use more strategies to actually get buy-in from all these particular actors, religious, traditional leaders to end harmful practices. And the last one, of course, is how do we then develop programs that are not only able to evaluate, but also monitor the compliance with the legal provisions and look at how the legal framework could be further improved to really decriminalize sexuality, but also to really look at how the influence or the influences of cultural, religious, and social practices can be reduced and addressed and efficiently. So, Patty, this is what I wanted to present very quickly. I'm not so sure how much of the questions the audience might have for me.
Thank you so much for that, Bashir, and apologies to everyone. I know it's been a little difficult to hear, but I hope you've been able to follow the slides in reading. And also, if you have access to the notes, Miriam has included a link to a document called Harmonizing the Legal Environment for Adolescent Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights. And that will provide you with a more in-depth view of what Bashir just presented. So hopefully you'll be able to see that. I know we're right at time right now, but perhaps we can open up for a couple of questions. I know one that's come in from Alex Bashir is just to get some clarity on what is included in sexual and reproductive health services. And perhaps we can take another one or two comments before Bashir responds and close there. I see Nancy has just answered that question in writing. Thank you, Nancy, for that. Any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no questions, then I propose we call it a close here. Again, I want to Yeah, I want to thank everyone for participating, particularly the presenters for taking the time to speak to us, and for the sort of active conversation that we've had throughout this session. I want to sort of take us back to the last slide that Rachel ended on, in terms of what are some of the steps that everyone on this call can take in the lawmaking process to ensure that it does respond to women's, children's, and adolescent health. And hope that over the next coming weeks, you will be engaged or able to engage in some of those, whether it be improving the consultation so that it integrates women, children, and adolescents, whether it's strengthening the mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation, or whether it's setting up a number of caucuses, or just starting a review process of existing laws. We'd be interested in hear if any of that is happening in your countries. We will, I see a couple of questions about this. We will, yes, be sharing the presentation so that you have these along with the background documents that you've mentioned. I just see that someone asked for the trail of the chat, and yes, we will send that as well in the form of a Q&A so that you have that information as well. Again, we're looking forward to seeing you next week. We'll be focusing on the budgetary processes next week. In the meantime, if you haven't filled out the survey, perhaps please remember to do that. And if you have any questions, suggestions on how to improve, or things that you want to see discussed, please feel free to reach out to us. Either myself or Miriam would be happy to spend some time with you. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and have an excellent Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Bye.
Thank you, Kadi.
Thank you.
Thank you.